Hi there, my name is Kent Campbell. I'm joined with Troy Burton, and we're pleased to present another therapist training video for you. Today, we're going to be talking about the CAMPT Code of Ethics. We're going to do our best to talk through the different standards in the CAMPT Ethical Code and hopefully do so in a way that's entertaining and informational. My name again, Kent Campbell. I'm a marriage and family therapist, and I operate my group practice called Family Matters and teach law and ethics to graduate students in counseling psychology. This video is designed to be informative for marriage and family therapists and other mental health practitioners who are going through their training process. Troy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Troy Burton. It's my first year in the program. I'm also a ambassador for the program as well. So if you have any questions, feel free to just shoot me an email and I can try to help you out as much as I can.
Fantastic. And so what I'll say here is that nearly every professional group is going to have their own code of ethics, but the ones used in mental health care are particularly important because so many small and large decisions need to be guided by a therapist's ethical foundation. And what this code seeks to do is to pass on lessons learned from decades of therapists in the past for those of us now here in the future. The philosophical approach to the ethical code amongst marriage and family therapists is that this code is alive. It needs to be interpreted and needs to change with changing times. The code 2 years ago was changed to make telehealth something that was seen as being much more accessible and appropriate. Likewise, supervision online. It used to be believed, the cultural expectation was that you couldn't do supervision online. And since the pandemic, that part has changed also. We're talking now about changing some pieces of the code to reflect artificial intelligence and how that's going to impact our field. And so, as part of this, what needs to happen is that folks in training to be mental health caregivers need to be familiar with the ethical code. The code here from the California Association of Marriage and Family Therapists, the professional organization for MFTs in the state of California. This code is easy to find at the CAMPT website. A simple online search will lead you to it. What Troy and I are going to do our best now is to talk you through these standards in a way that's going to be giving a bit of a summary and overview. One thing I would encourage you, the viewer, to do is to stop and pause this video as often as you like to read the standards either on my screen or that you might find at the CAMPT website. Troy and I are going to talk about some of the highlights, but I think you'd benefit from pausing our video and reading some of the details as you go through. What we've done is highlighted many of the different parts that we think is most important to understand the standards. And so as you can see here, this is where we're going to begin. Another part of this process is the whole idea about ethical decision-making. The CAMPT Ethics Code and surely graduate classes and otherwise are going to talk a lot about decision-making models and how that should happen. And I'd also encourage people to join CAMPT as a professional organization. In addition to legal counsel, decreased fees for liability insurance, access to the CAMPT Therapist magazine is simply crucial for therapists who want to remain up to date on changes in the ethics code as well as laws impacting the profession in the state. And so with that, what I'll say is our first section here is responsibility to clients or patients. And for me, I'm going to use the word client and patient interchangeably. To me, they're indicating the same thing, where patient is a word that means the person who is suffering. What therapists are looking to do is alleviate suffering in our clients and patients. And so our first sentence here says, marriage and family therapists advance the welfare of families and individuals, respect the rights of those persons seeking their assistance, and make reasonable efforts to ensure that their services are used appropriately. To me, this articulates the value of client autonomy. What therapists believe is that every person has a right to decide how they want to live their life, and they need to be empowered to make decisions in therapy as well. Our first piece here talks about non-discrimination, the way that it is unethical for a therapist to decide not to work with someone just because they're not interested in something about that person's identity. That is not an acceptable reason to not see someone as a patient. It's interesting because clinically, a person actually might not be very skilled at helping that individually, but it would be unethical to discriminate and not see that person. That is, if someone were to come in to see a therapist and that client was someone who was one of our neighbors in the LGBTQ plus community, every clinician is supposed to open the door and welcome that person in. It could be that clinician might not be terribly skilled or connected to that community, and care might not be as good, but the idea is legally, you're not allowed to say you can't see someone just because of that. Part of the reason why is that historically, mental health care has not been terribly good to all of our neighbors in this country. There have been African Americans who were used as subjects of research experiments that they were not willing or interested in being a part of or aware of. There are ways that the psychological diagnostic code has labeled our neighbors because of their sexual and gender identity and preferences, and those things likewise not helpful. And so our code begins with this idea that therapists have a responsibility to be open and clear and to treat people well. Section 1.4 talks about termination and the idea that each part of the therapeutic process is important and has value. And for termination here, what that means is that when a therapy is going to end, that it's important to use good judgment to navigate that process. A therapist can choose to terminate a treatment if it's not going well, if it needs to end for a number of reasons. A client can choose to end when they think they're ready with therapy. But the idea is that therapists need to be intentional about ending treatment when appropriate and not continuing it just because they don't want to make anything different. To not take care of your clients would be what we call abandonment. The idea that a therapist is not taking care of their patients well and not making clinically sound decisions to take care of them, where the ending of the treatment is going to result in additional suffering on the part of the client. Important to make sure that we don't just stop seeing someone without proper care. Along those lines, section 1.8 about financial gain, a therapist wouldn't just keep seeing a client just because they were only gaining money and the client wasn't getting better. Troy, I remember hearing a story a long time ago, 20 years ago, about a particular therapist in town who was working with a client, and the only reason therapy was going is because the client wouldn't get money from the family estate unless he had weekly therapy. And so the client would come in and say, I don't have anything to talk about, but I just have to be here to get my check from the family estate. And the therapist would sit there because he's just getting paid for it. That story came out through consultation was one that was the most evident to me yet of that's an unethical thing to do.
Right.
And then our last section here in this first part, that therapists work with their patients to develop treatment plans that are going to hopefully be helpful to the client and help them get what they're seeking out of treatment. Part of this is talking about informed consent, the idea that a client is participating in the process and knows why they're in session and what they're looking for. And I found a lot of people really want to know what are our plans and goals about how this is going to work. So there's a brief overview of section number 1. You can pause the video here if you'd like to read more in detail, but we're going to keep rolling with section number 2.
Yeah, so I think this one's a big one. I think confidentiality it should be highlighted in big fat blue, just because it's really important, and it's like the base of the relationship that you have with the client. So marriage and family therapists respect the confidence of their client and patient. Can I use client? Is that okay?
You bet.
Okay. Marriage and family therapists have unique confidentiality responsibilities because the client in a therapeutic relationship may include more than one person. So basically, disclosures of confidentiality information, I think there's a lot to unpack here. One thing that really stands out to me is when a client is, so like to anyone except as mandated by law. So if a client, is not asking you to release it, but I remember in class we talked about how if like a state mandated law, you can even, like, the judge calls and you can be like, well, I can't confirm nor deny this is my client out of respect for their confidentiality. But if it is
That's right.
mandated, right, you have to give that over. So I think that's really a big part in that, because I had no idea. I would
Yeah.
I would be really scared to get a phone call from a judge, be like, I'm not Troy. Can I leave a message? So I think that's a important part to know.
You're right. But you're right, it provides that foundation, because if I can't tell you, my therapist, everything I need to, because I'm worried you're gonna talk out of turn about me, why would I share this with you, right?
Right, exactly. Because it's like calculated. Should I really open up this much? It's like all depending on what the client is like going in for therapy for, right? So yeah. Signed authorizations, release of information. When there is a request for information related to any aspect of psychotherapy or treatment, each member of the unit receiving such therapeutic treatment must sign an authorization before a marriage and family therapist will disclose information received from any member of the treatment unit. I think that's great. I think it's covering, our behinds and looking out for our, best interests for the clients.
Exactly. And making sure that they're informed in the process about what's happening and who's sharing what information.
Exactly. And it's just being transparent, you know what I mean? Like it's black and white. I like that.
Yep. And the good news is it's really easy to share information when someone wants us to. So I have a call with a psychiatrist tomorrow. It's really easy for me to complete the legal form, have the client sign it, and then I can talk to the psychiatrist, and the client gets better care because this process works.
Yeah.
And so I've said a couple of times the idea about informed consent, and this, to me, it's this notion that a client understands everything that's happening and what their options are, and they can make a good choice about it. So our preamble here says that MFTs respect the fundamental autonomy of clients and support their informed decision-making. MFTs assess their clients' competence, make appropriate disclosures, and provide comprehensive information so that the clients understand the treatment decisions. We spend a lot of time in our class together talking about all the different nuances about what this means and looks like. But again, this idea about the value of autonomy, that MFTs want clients to be able to make good decisions on their own. And to do so, clients need to know a certain amount of information. Sometimes that means the therapist disclosing things about their own personal selves or values. How that might happen in a way a client might say, hey, are you a parent, or have you ever gone through this experience before? And the therapist might decide to say yay or nay about how their own personal experience has impacted them being in that position. Sometimes that's helpful for a client to make a good decision. Also important to know the risks and benefits. And so the kind of things that I'll say are, you should know that if we start talking about this trauma in your life, it's likely to bring up some painful feelings for you. And this might make you feel worse for the next few weeks before you start to feel better. That there might be harm caused if we start talking about some of these difficult things, as well as the benefits. That I've worked with other people before with similar issues who've seen great progress. The therapist needs to be responsible to make sure that the client knows how to contact them when they're out of town, or when it comes to the weekends. Oftentimes, therapists will point a client towards a crisis line so they could get assistance when the therapist is not available. It's also important to say that we're not on call 24/7. It's our job to help people as best we can, though. We talked about limits of confidentiality and mandated reporting in our last section. And here the code articulates that if a therapist suspects there's been child abuse or the abuse of an adult, or if a patient is going to be dangerous to themselves, the therapist has an obligation to report that to the authorities. And clients need to know that so that they can make a good decision. We're supposed to talk with them about our licensure and about what our education is. We should definitely make sure that we're in a good position to treat someone. That means not treating someone who's part of your family or you're close to. The last section here talks about treatment alternatives. And what this means is that it's important for clients to be able to say, I really want to do therapy instead of acupuncture or we're reading books or exercising or taking medication, or I want to be able to do therapy and take medication, that there need to be discussions about what else could happen instead of these. And our last section here, 3.12, is talking about the idea of records and notes, that a responsible therapist will keep good notes so that it's clear that the therapist is making intentional decisions that way.
Yeah, I learned in this class that you want to have your notes really good to save all the info. But this is my favorite one: dual and multiple relationships. I remember in class, I just had to ask. I was like, if you do real estate and your client, you just have such a great relationship with them, and they're like, oh man, like I'm looking for a house, I can't find a good realtor. They're all so boring in their big boxy suits, and they're just blah, and you're just like sitting there, and you are a realtor and you want to help them, but like you can't,
Right.
because
Right.
it falls into this category. But I had to ask, maybe there is just like a separate one where I could get in there, but it falls into the dual relationship. So marriage and family therapists establish and maintain professional relationship boundaries that prioritize therapeutic benefit and safeguard the best interest of their clients against exploitation. Marriage and family therapists engage in ethical multiple relationships with caution and in a manner that is congruent with their therapeutic role.
Exactly. I think that's the only hope for you, is that that second sentence. MFTs, when they do engage in multiple relationships, they're ethical about it. So
right.
If you were to live in a small town and you're the only realtor and the only therapist in 100 miles, I think you're good there. You can be clear.
That's the loophole, right? Oh
Yep.
man, looks like I'm moving to Hollister. No, I'm kidding.
Exactly.
Okay, so the dual relationship occurs when a therapist and his client
So currently engage.
I know. Sorry, my thing froze for a second.
Okay.
I can see now. In one or more separate and distant relationship, not all dual multiple relationships are unethical, and some need not be avoided, including those that are due to geographic proximity, which is like what you said, right? If like you're one realtor in the area, then it's okay. Diverse communities recognize marriage and family therapists, treatment models, community activities, or the fall within the context of culturally congruent relationships. Marriage family therapists are aware of their influential positions with respect to clients and avoid relationships that are reasonably likely to exploit the trust and or dependent of a client, or which may impair the therapist's professional judgment.
I hope that your voice is still there on the recording. The piece I was going to say here is that when it comes to that idea about dual relationships, exploitive ones are what we want to avoid, right? For me to borrow money from a client and then be paying that money back, not so helpful. If we both have kids on the same soccer team, and so we see each other at soccer games, but I'm their therapist, is there a way that could be managed where it wouldn't be exploitative? I think probably so. I imagine the way that some clergy provide therapy for people in their congregation, that would be a dual relationship that may or may not be upsetting, exploitative.
Unethical dual multiple relationships. Acts that could result in unethical dual relationships include, but are not limited to, borrowing money from a client, hiring a client, or engaging in a business venture with a patient, or engaging in a close personal relationship with a client. Such acts with a client, spouse, partner, or immediate family member are likely to be considered unethical dual relationships.
Exactly.
So that's kind of like what you were saying earlier.
Yep.
Non-professional relationships with former clients. Prior to engaging in a non-sexual relationship with former clients, marriage and family therapists take care to avoid engaging in interactions which may be exploitive or harmful to the former client. Marriage and family therapists consider factors which include, but are not limited to, the potential continued emotional vulnerability of the former client, the anticipated consequences of involvement with that person, and the elimination of the possibility that the former client resumes therapy in the future with the therapist.
Mm-hmm. There we go. And so this idea that after therapy ends, is it possible to be, yep, on the soccer team, attending the same class, going to the same church, things like that, that those all be things to think about.
Sexual contact includes, but is not limited to, sexual intercourse, sexual intimacy, and sexual explicit communications without a sound clinical basis and rational for treatment. Sexual contact with the client or client's spouse or partner or client's immediate family member during the therapeutic relationship or during 2 years following the termination of the therapeutic relationship is unethical.
Yeah.
That I remember in class so clear. I had no idea. I just thought in general, like if you have a client, you know, like you can never have that relationship. But it definitely stood out to me that if you are feeling a certain type of way with a client, and I even said to you, I was like, but professor, what if she's the one? You know what I mean? And you're like, no, Troy, no, it has to be 2 years after termination. So if your love is really the one and she holds on for 2 years after, professor, I don't know, maybe she was. You know what I mean?
And as long as we're laughing about this because we're poking fun of this and trying to make it interesting about a very serious topic. But yes, and the idea also is you can't just end therapy because you've decided that she's the one.
Right.
You have to make sure that you've treated her for her anxiety treatment until the end, and then 2 years later. And then you'd have the chance with the bare minimum of the ethics code to send her those flowers, reach out to her. The other part of that conversation in class, though, is that most everyone else said, I don't think that ever dating someone that you've been the therapist for is a real hot idea. But the minimum requirement that we're joking about here in the ethics code says 2 years. That's right.
Yeah.
And likewise, if you've had a prior sexual relationship, that's not supposed to happen as well. The goal is looking to see that things wouldn't be exploitative.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. So section number 5, professional competency and integrity. MFTs maintain high standards of professional competence and integrity. It's interesting that the more I review these codes and think about this way of operating as a business person, it comes with it expectations that outside of work, an MFT and other mental health care professionals are really held to kind of a higher standard than we might expect the everyday member of the public. The idea is that MFTs have to demonstrate sound judgment, both professionally and personally. And if MFTs make decisions in their personal life that reflect poor decision-making, or I guess I'll leave it at that, poor decision-making, that can lead to consequences that impact the professional licensure of the person. And so this idea that you're not, supposed to be, if you're convicted of a crime substantially related to the professional qualifications, you could be expelled from the professional organization or have your license suspended or otherwise be put on probation. This idea that if an MFT were to engage in something that demonstrates exploitation of other people or poor judgment, that someone would potentially be in the position of having to have some pretty serious consequences to something they've worked really hard to obtain. To get an MFT license is a daunting, near decade-long task. And so these are pretty big consequences that we need to be aware of. Other pieces you can imagine that financial incentives should not be discussed that would involve withholding or limiting someone's psychological care. We look to do our best. Practicing while impaired, this idea that clinicians should not be engaging in their work due to physical or psychological causes or the use of alcohol or other substances. So using before or during a session or day at work, not a hot idea. Staying current, the piece I said before about MFTs need to know about what's happening, what the current research and laws are, and current practices, whether we're teaching, supervising, from researchers in the session. We need to be able to stay up to date about current trends. And one of the issues in our society right now is this sensitivity to diversity, this idea that we need to be much more aware of the notion that I am a middle-aged white guy and that my thoughts and ideas about what's right and wrong are going to be different than someone else sitting across from me. And it's not my job to impose my value system on someone else, but rather to understand what their value system is and help them make good decisions within that. One of the pieces that comes with that is the idea of gift giving. There are some times of the year when it's traditional for folks to give gifts to each other. And the notion here is that not that MFTs can't give or receive gifts, but they need to carefully consider the clinical and cultural implications of giving or receiving gifts or tokens of appreciation. This could include the financial value of the item, what it means to the client, what their motivation is for giving, and likewise, what it would mean if the therapist were to decline the gift. If the therapist says, "That's so nice of you, but I can't accept that," that doesn't work very well. I had one client who gave me one time, she harvested the pumpkin seeds from her pumpkin and baked them and put spices on them and gave it to me in a little mason jar. And I think that's the fantastic token that she gave to me around the holiday time in December, where to her, it was a way of, she says, sharing some of something that's important to her, her home gardening, the monetary value really low. Whether I'm going to use it or not doesn't matter. What mattered to her was that she was sharing her gifts of the harvest with me, right? We can imagine some gifts that would be under $20 that would be inappropriate because they're either sexual or cigarettes or something, right? Like you can't, the price is not always going to be the part of it. And then I would argue there are times when the therapist giving a gift is helpful. At the end of treatment for a child, for the therapist to give the child a token at the end of the treatment, I think can be really powerful and helpful. So the meaning of things makes a big difference. Talked about the idea about therapists need to be really aware of their own values and notions that they're sharing and communicating. And one of the other videos on this channel, the therapist in training suggested that the value of ambition might be something that the therapist, would hold as being really important, but the client might not see ambition or climbing a social ladder as being something that's of value. And so they need to be attuned to things that are obvious and subtle. Scope of competence is an important concept, this idea that MFTs are going to practice within their scope of competence. The law says that I can treat all sorts of issues related to behaviors or relationships, mental disorders in the DSM that's this thick. But in reality, the things I'm really best at are helping with marriages and anxiety and divorce. And maybe next year I'm going to learn how to treat people with trauma using EMDR. And so I'm going to study and learn and train this other trauma treatment called EMDR, and I'm going to add that to my scope of competence. But this is this idea that we're aware of our limitations. And to me, I like the idea that there are a lot of different really good therapists out there, and that I'm not the only one who needs to be available, that there are lots of good therapists for people to find. And lastly, the idea of consultation, that it's appropriate for MFTs to discuss what's happening with other clinicians in order to improve the quality of the care we're giving and improve the welfare of the client. Listening to a podcast, there was someone who suggested that consultation should be made illegal. And that goes against the very code of ethics of our field. What we believe in is that discussing things and learning is the way to get better.
So telehealth, basically when utilizing telehealth to provide services to clients, marriage and family therapists consider the welfare of the client, the appropriateness and the suitability of the modality in meeting the client's needs, make appropriate disclosures to the client regarding its use, exercise reasonable care when utilizing technology, and remain current with the relevant laws and regulations. Basically, I think what this means is you just want to make sure it's a good idea for the client and that they're aware of exactly what they're getting themselves into. Make sure that, if you do telehealth, You could have technical issues, Wi-Fi, freezing, call
Mhm.
drop, all of it. So, and then just like the risks, but I also think it's a good idea. You could be at the comfort of your home,
Mhm.
and you could wear your jammies and a nice shirt on top. No one would know. You know what I mean? So that's comforting. Telehealth, marriage and family therapists take precautions to meet their responsibilities to clients who are not physically present during the provision of therapy. Prior to utilizing telehealth, marriage and family therapists consider the appropriateness and suitability of this therapeutic modality and meeting the client's needs to do so competently. The
Mhm.
suitability and appropriateness of the telehealth includes consideration of multiple factors such as the client's familiarity with the modality, the issues to be addressed, and the therapeutic orientation and other factors.
Yeah. And I wonder if we can, you mentioned the idea about risks and modality there, about freezing, the benefits of being in telehealth.
Mhm.
To me, I think about the way that for some, another important piece is going to be for this person and these issues, is this helpful? For my patient who uses hearing aids, telehealth does not work very well because he can't hear what I'm saying
Right.
clearly enough, right? And for someone who's dealing with a real serious um, mental disorder, that might not be such a good fit either.
Yeah. I think we talked about it in class too, where it's like if it's appropriate, and also I think kind of just like your style of being a therapist.
Mhm.
I speaking on personally, I'm doing telehealth right now, and there's been moments where I will, the floodgates will come, man, and I would love a hug from my therapist. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
And so I think that it's like not it's a different vibe, right? You're talking to a screen, but you're a good person on the other side, but it's just not that physical touch that you might need.
Mhm.
So
You bet. Makes me think too. I was surprised with some couples who are on two different screens. Sometimes it helps them from talking over each other because it's like they're in their own bubble almost.
that's cool.
Surprising.
I can see what you mean by that. That's cool.
Yeah.
Disclosures. Marriage and family therapists inform clients of the potential risks, consequences, and benefits of telehealth modality, including but not limited to issues of confidentiality, clinical limitations, and transmission technical difficulties.
Hmm. You
Yeah.
know, one
So,
we haven't. Go ahead.
oh no, no, you go ahead.
I was just going to say the one piece we haven't spoken about is the idea about privacy, and that um, if I'm on the phone, maybe in my bedroom at home, I don't know if someone's listening on the other side of the door or
Yeah.
how private that space is. And so I know of some clients who do their therapy from their automobile because it's soundproof and they can see who's around them, but
Yeah.
not everyone has space to make that work really well. Does it say anything about social media here? We'll get to that part in a bit. All right. And so section number 7, thinking about the supervisee um, relationships. The idea is that whether you're a supervisor, a supervisee, a teacher, or a student, there are norms that are expected also. MFTs in this position are aware of their impact on the professional development of their supervisees and students. You don't exploit these relationships, and whenever possible, appropriately safeguard the best interest of the client, patient, student, supervisee. This idea that it's my role as the supervisor to make sure I have the best intentions of uh, my students, my supervisees in mind when I'm going through this. As such, maintaining boundaries is really important. Boundaries here meaning that we're careful about what's professional and what's social, and or even different ways of being professional. We talked about not having business relationships with clients. Same idea here. We don't want to have sexual relationships with students or supervisees, don't want to go into different business ventures with them. Our role is to stay focused on this idea about teaching and learning. That's where our attention needs to be. Examples here again, no borrowing money from your supervisees, or engaging in a close relationship with one of your supervisees' family members. Sexual harassment, likewise, something that our code says is not to be taken lightly and not to happen in the position of supervisees or students and teachers. Supervisors need to make sure that they're doing their best to maintain their skills in the field and keeping atop of current regulations and practices. Need to know what the laws and regulations are. Go back in 7.8 to this idea about culture and diversity, that we need to be aware of how these parts are important to keep in mind, and that we need to be sure that we're paying attention to valuing our differences, able to talk about them and see how they impact us, but that we're intentional and aware of them. Bartering with supervisees, just like with clients, not encouraged. We need to make sure that we're focusing on just having this professional relationship this way. We need to document our decisions to dismiss people and make sure that we're doing the best we can to be the best supervisor we can be, and make sure our supervisees are following all appropriate laws and regulations. That brings us to number 8.
Responsibility to colleagues. To promote the welfare and best interests of clients, marriage and family therapists collaborate with other professionals, communicate with and about colleagues in a respectful manner, and strive to maintain constructive working relationships with colleagues.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Any thoughts on what this means to you?
Basically, I think this means, you want to have a good relationship, right? A respectful one. And I think if you have a respectful relationship with them, it just enhances the environment for everybody. And also, I think a little bit lower, it kind of talks about like if you have a problem with them, you don't want to go running to like social media, right?
Exactly. That what we want to do is find respectful ways to resolve conflict, that we want to make sure that our ethical code is telling us the right thing to do is, if there's a conflict with another clinician, to talk about it directly. Blasting someone on social media or leaving a bad review about someone, those are not ways that we solve problems in this field, that we're to model responsible interactions in the ways that that happens. 8.4 says you're not allowed to steal patients from other therapists. This idea that we're acting with integrity, and if there are reasons why we think a colleague is impaired or practicing unethically, that we're intentional about how to bring that up to them directly, and then finding ways to make that happen.
Yeah, I have a question for you. Is this common? Yeah. Does this happen common where like people as colleagues don't really mesh well or have interactions?
Speaking off the top of my head, colloquially, I would say that most of the time therapists are folks who pay close attention to getting along well with other people, and who want to be polite, and so that happens, I think, most of the time. There have been a few reasons I've seen, particularly through the ethics committee. So I volunteer on the camp ethics committee, where we receive complaints about members who have violated these. And some of the complaints are about therapists who are not treating each other professionally when it comes to resolving a conflict. Oftentimes it comes from a simple disagreement that gets escalated. I've heard stories about therapists essentially poaching clients from other therapists. There are reasons why people get upset. But the idea is it's more likely to happen if we're talking about an issue that's important to me, and I really think something strongly different than you, and we're arguing online or in person, that those kind of things might escalate.
I gotcha. Yeah, because I was gonna say, I agree with you. I think, being a therapist, you're pretty good with talking about your feelings. So it should be very, yeah.
I think they're just the way it doesn't happen is that if the therapist is looking to avoid conflict, and so I don't want to get in a conflict with this person, so I'm not going to talk to them. And that's the spot that needs to change, having a polite way to talk to someone instead of moving elsewhere.
Gotcha.
So statement number 9, responsibility of the profession. MFTs cooperate with colleagues to act in the best interest of the profession. MFTs participate in activities that advance the goals of profession. So what that means is that what we're looking to do is to support mental health care for the community, for all of our neighbors, and supporting ways that we can, looking for ways we can support one another. The code here talks about making sure that if you're going to write an article and you have an idea, that you're citing the sources and attributing things. To me, the parts that stick out more are the idea in this standard about pro bono services, that we want to make sure our ethics code says that we are encouraged to participate in activities that better community mental health, including devoting a portion of our weekly schedule to people who are paying little or no money for their therapy services. In our society, our state, our country, there are a lot of ways that it's imbalanced about who has access to care and who does not. And what our ethics code says is that we're supposed to take some portion of our caseload and devote that to either doing volunteer work in the community or seeing people at a reduced cost. The number I like to think about, sometimes people say seeing 20 clients hours per week in private practice is full-time. And to me, having 2 of those be low-fee people is a way that I think that is 10% of the number of people being seen, that's one way to do that. I saw someone last night who volunteers for a religious organization as a psychiatrist. She gives her services there. There are different ways we can give back to community, but this idea that that's something we're supposed to be a part of. And public policy as well. There's much debate these last few months here in Santa Clara County as the Child Protective Services made a change in policy where they had parents who were accused of abusing their children allowed to sit in on the interview with the child. The problem there being MFTs are aware that the child may not speak honestly if their abuser is in the room. And so MFTs spoke out against this concerning policy and it was changed. Standard number 10 talks about following the legal system appropriately and how we're supposed to serve as expert witnesses and people in the court. I think that part's kind of self-explanatory. And excuse me. In addition to the court piece, section number 11 talks about responsibility to research participants. Likewise, these are things for folks who are managing research projects, and that's not something most of us end up working with. But here's section number 12.
Marriage and family therapists make financial arrangements with clients and supervisees that are understandable and confirmed to accept professional practice and legal requirements. So the disclosures of fees prior to the commencement of treatment, marriage and family therapists disclose their fees and the basis upon which they are computed, including but not limited to charges for canceled or missed appointments and any interest to be charged on unpaid balances, and give reasonable notice of any changes in fees or other charges.
Exactly. So you're announcing what your fee is and when it's charged and what the policies are.
Bartering. Marriage and family therapists ordinarily refrain from accepting goods or services from clients in return for services rendered due to the potential for conflicts, exploitation, and or distortion of the professional relationship. Bartering should only be considered and conducted if the client requests it. The bartering is not otherwise exploitive or detrimental to the therapeutic relationship, and it is negotiated without basically concern. Married and family. I'm sorry.
Coercion, you bet. Not twisting someone's arm to say that this is what we should really do instead. Exactly.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I like that. It reminds me of the trade-off.
Correct. No trading therapy for other services, more often than not in most places. And then our last standard on advertising, this idea that MFTs advertise appropriately and recognize that all advertising enables consumers to choose professional services based upon accurate information. This is actually a piece that was changed a couple of years ago. And part of it, so it used to be something like MFTs did very little to advertise their services or compete with their peers. And that was the standard for everywhere, and also for things like music teachers and other professions where you don't compete with your peers. You kind of hope all boats are going to rise together. The problem there is it looks a little bit like antitrust violations if therapists don't try to say why their services are better or different than others. And so now, particularly with reviews online and otherwise, it's important for MFTs to talk about what their services are and how that works. And so that's a part about how that has changed. What it means is that you're allowed to say online, these are the things I offer and this is why. But we need to be accurate in the way that we do that. When you're coming up with a business name, 13.3 says you're supposed to make sure that what it says is that you are indeed this person doing this work. And then 13.6 is about solicitation of reviews, essentially. And the language here now says MFTs do not solicit testimonials from clients who, due to their particular circumstances, are vulnerable to undue influence. So it used to say MFTs don't ask for any online reviews and don't publish them online. Now you're allowed to solicit reviews, but you need to be careful about who you're asking them of. If you're asking a current patient who's in great crisis and really wants you to like them, that person would probably not be a good candidate for an MFT to ask a review from. What you're supposed to do is find someone who is in a really good place, maybe someone you don't directly provide therapy for anymore, and someone who's in a good position without feeling like they have any pressure upon them to write a review. To me, this has always been tricky because you want to give people a chance to say good things about you, and a lot of the way that people find each other now, find therapists, is over the internet, and so reviews make a really big difference. But what this says is you can do so if you do so carefully. Should you ask for reviews or not is another question, but the code says you're allowed to. What I'll say is that well, first, I really appreciate you being here to help talk these through, and that it used to, every time I read it, the list gets a little bit shorter and makes a little bit more sense. And my hope is that as MFTs, graduate students in training, as you become more familiar with all the rules and laws, it becomes less daunting, less intimidating, and feels like something that's more manageable. Any takeaways from you today as we finish up?
Yeah, I'm not going to lie. After going over this right now and not being in class the first time, it does feel a lot better,
Yes.
Because it did put the fear of God in me. I'm not going to lie. This class definitely did. It, and I think it's good in whatever you do to know like the laws and the rules of what you're doing, but it's very kind of common sense, very like straightforward, and I like that. So.
Yeah, exactly, right? Consistent in this idea that we're to be careful not to exploit people and make sure that people can make good choices. Yep.
Right.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, let's sign off here then. I'm going to say thanks to all of you for watching. Thanks again to Troy Burton for joining us today. Best wishes to you all, and here's till next time. Bye for now.